Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Great to see this tent absolutely packed. It's a delight to be back at Truckware and the Beyond Borders Festival. My name is Allan Little, and I'm a journalist and broadcaster. And it's my privilege this afternoon to introduce you to Valerie Plame. Valerie, you will know, shot to global renown in 2003 when her cover as a CIA operative was blown in very controversial circumstances. I want to ask Valerie about how that happened and what it reveals about the state of American politics in the George W. Bush era, and whether there's any connection between the unconstitutional behavior at the top of American politics in those days and what has happened since. But more than anything, I want to ask Valerie why she joined the CIA in the first place. And there will be plenty of time for questions from you, so please, when the time comes, have your questions ready. Valerie, you joined the agency very young. Why?
Thank you, Alan, and thank you to the organizers as well, Mark and everyone here. Thank you for allowing me to, after 3 tries, third time's a charm, family emergencies prevented 2 previous attempts. So I'm delighted to be here in your Scottish summer, as it were.
We get 2 or 3 days like this a year, you know.
Brilliant. I joined the CIA because I come from a family of public service. My father served in the Air Force. He was an officer, and he fought in World War II in the South Pacific. My brother was a Marine in Vietnam. He was wounded there. My mother was a public school teacher. So when I was given this opportunity to join the CIA, I jumped at it because, well, first of all, it seemed like it was a lot more interesting than what my friends were doing. And I love the idea that the government was going to pay me to live and work abroad. And I joined in the mid-'80s when the Cold War was at its height, and it was very clear who was wearing black hats and who had white hats, and it was appealing. And besides, when you're that young, you're like, well, what the hell? I'll try it.
It's because I grew up in the 70s and into adulthood in the 1980s, and I suppose, if I'm honest, at the time you were joining the CIA, I thought of it as the organization which, since the Second World War, had operated with complete impunity, in secrecy, around the world, tearing down legitimate governments.
And you would not be incorrect. I also had those concerns. I was thinking to myself as I'm going through the process, which is quite long and drawn out, is it true about the exploding cigar and Fidel Castro? And what I know even more so now, for instance, in Iran in 1952, the CIA got their start with a coup in Iran, toppling a democratically elected prime minister. But those were all quite hazy for me. I didn't quite understand it. But I was drawn to the idea that I suppose serving and doing something larger than myself. And in my undergraduate, I went to Penn State University, very, quintessential sort of undergraduate U.S. college experience. And as lovely as it was, I just knew I wanted out. I wanted out of central Pennsylvania. And I thought if the CIA didn't work out, I was looking at the Peace Corps or, something else. I traveled a lot with my parents internationally, and that was attractive to me.
The CIA station chief in Tehran in 1952-53, when the Mossadegh government was overthrown, went with the gloriously unimprovable name of Kermit Roosevelt.
Yes, son of.
Son of, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And but that is an emblematic moment in America's relationship with the rest of the world. It is America basically deciding that it should have the right, as the arsenal of democracy that won the Second World War, to choose who governs other countries.
Precisely. There's a book I would recommend. It's called The Brothers. I can't remember the author, but it lays out the 2 brothers of that decade in U.S. foreign policy making, Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles. One ran the CIA, one ran the State Department, and they were the very elite, the very cream of what American aristocracy was at that point in time. And they thought it was their absolute right, indeed their responsibility, to run the world as they saw fit. And in the meantime, if they helped enrich friends and cronies, okay. But I think the CIA, I've read a couple books on that particular coup, and they didn't really know how successful it would be. And once they got a taste of that blood, you know, they kept going.
And did you buy into that post-war American mission, the idea that America should be the global policeman, that America should have a sphere of interest in which it basically decided what system of government, who should govern, and so on?
I can't say that my thinking was that sophisticated, seriously. You know, I was 21. But I did think, my 21-year-old self was thinking, for all our faults in the United States, it is still, to my mind, the best country in the world for many reasons. There was a U.S. politician, I forget who it was right now, just recently got into a whole lot of trouble, Cuomo, for saying the United States was unexceptional. And that would be true. But as Winston Churchill said, you know, democracy is terrible except for all the other forms of government that have been tried. So we'll talk later about where we are today, but I like the idea of serving something bigger than myself.
And you'd learned to be a spy.
I learned to be a spy.
How did that happen?
The CIA has a pretty intensive training program. First, just getting in is quite an ordeal. It takes, at least in my case, 6 to 8 months. And you go through all sorts of tests and psychological evaluations and security background checks and medical evaluations and multiple choice exams. And honestly, it was all a blur, except I still remember one of the questions on the multiple choice exam, which was, do you like tall women? Oh my God, I don't know. Is that funny?
That's bizarre.
How do you feel about tall women?
I'm not going to answer that question.
But so I was hired. I was hired to go into operations, which at that time I was one of the few women hired specifically to go into operations. Hitherto, all the women in operations, that is, the ones doing the field work, recruiting the spies overseas, had generally been secretaries, really, who got really bored of being secretaries and just sort of through dint of intelligence and perseverance pushed their way into becoming a field operative. But they hired me to go into the field, and you could either be in operations or the DI, which is Directorate of Intelligence. Those are the analysts. Or you could be in the DS&T, Science and Technology, or Directorate of Administration. And clearly, as anyone who came in with me would tell you, well, of course, the ops officers are the best. And so they start there. They put everyone in, those that were recruited and put into what we were called career trainee classes. And we did paramilitary training at a place called The Farm, which is outside of Washington, D.C., and that's where I learned to do things like fire every sort of weapon imaginable. I did a lot of escape and evasion exercises in the woods. You do interrogation exercises. You learn how to skin a deer. It's all these. I thought it was sort of camp for adults, but it was pretty intense, and it was led by former military officers, and they were, as they always are, bound and determined to break you down. But it wasn't because we were going to be parachuted behind enemy lines. It was to build an esprit de corps, because those people with whom you came in and were up to your waist in swamp water, those were going to be presumably your future colleagues, and you really know someone's temperament and character when they're tired and hot and
you,
under duress.
Because you chose undercover work, you had to learn to live a lie. You had to learn to live a secret identity, and so you had to have two selves. How is that psychologically? How easy is that to sustain that?
I didn't really think that much about it because it's so integral to what you do. I mean, it becomes part of the fabric of who you are. I never lived two lives. I lived one life that was completely interwoven. And it didn't bother me that I couldn't tell all but my parents people where I really worked or what I did, because I understood that it wasn't some whimsical decision. It was there was reasons why I couldn't tell people what I did, and I had no problem with that.
So when you first met the man you married, what did he think you did?
So I met and married Joe Wilson in 1998, and when at that time I was under deep cover and I was doing venture capital, and so I told him this, and he was telling me it was a very crowd and loud cocktail party at the Turkish embassy in Washington, D.C. We were both living overseas, but we met at this embassy, and I thought I had seen him before, and it turned out I probably had, because he had been on TV quite a bit. He had been in charge of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad during the first Gulf War. But he's telling me this, and it's really loud, and I'm only getting bits and pieces of the conversation. But it became clear early on that we were very serious. And I thought the good news is that he's an ambassador. He was an ambassador at that point, so he certainly understood about the CIA. But I was so nervous when I finally told him where I worked. I mean, I'd never done that before. And I thought, well, at least he's not going to go running to the newspapers or something. But when I told him, to his credit, the only thing he said to me was, "Is your real name Valerie?" Yes.
But you didn't tell him all this at the Turkish ambassador's party.
No.
This was much, much later, when you were already in a serious relationship.
It moved quickly. Yeah.
And you were stationed abroad?
Yes.
And you developed an expertise in weapons of mass destruction?
Yes, that came about because in the mid-'90s, so don't forget, okay, so the Berlin Wall comes down, the intelligence budget contracts severely, there's very little money, and the raison d'etre of the CIA is just vanished. And so I was living and working in Europe, and it just seemed like, this is so boring, frankly. I don't get, what's the point now?
There's nothing to spy on anymore.
No, right. And I thought, well, I'll stay in Europe. I had some job offers, and that seemed perfectly fine with me. But they had just set up something called the Counterproliferation Division in the CIA. And you may recall in 1996, there was a terrorist attack on the Tokyo subway. And there were dozens of people that were killed in the sarin gas attack. It was I can't remember the name of the Japanese terrorist group. In any case, it was the first time that anyone in the U.S. government had really thought about weapons of mass destruction, other than a little office here and a little office there. So they set up this whole division in the CIA, Counterproliferation Division, looking at chemical, biological, nuclear threats in a much more thorough, systemic way. And I was asked to join that and work for someone that I respected. So I thought, okay, that seems reasonable to me. If I'm not doing terrorism, I want to do this. And that's why I stayed.
And that brought you, of course, right to the heart of the most important issue of the day after 9/11 and the attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. Mm-hmm. You were in D.C. at that time.
Right.
What was the atmosphere like?
From when exactly?
After 9/11.
Well, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, I mean, we knew we were at war. There was no question. And for a ever so brief moment, the United States had the entire world behind them, the entire world. And I thought we were right to go into Afghanistan because that's where.
And that was within 2 months of 9/11.
Oh yes, it was. And the first
quick.
ones in were CIA, going to making overtures and liaison with the Northern Alliance, and as it went on, if you might recall, there were some anthrax scares. I mean, there was that time period. Fear was the predominant emotion. Almost every day, Americans were subjected to, well, today's threat level is at yellow. Today's at, and of course, fear is such a powerful, motivating factor. And of course, even working at the CIA, I had no idea of these so-called extraordinary renditions we were doing about the euphemistically named enhanced interrogation techniques, which...
You didn't know anything about that?
No. Called torture. But it quickly became apparent as we moved toward war with Iraq that the Bush administration was bound and determined to go to war with Iraq.
And you were highly skeptical about that?
I would say I was more neutral about that. My job at that time, I was the head of operations they had set up something called the Iraq Task Force or something like that. And the idea was to figure out what the heck was going on in terms of particularly Saddam Hussein's nuclear capacity, because we had no idea what was going on. Saddam Hussein had kicked out all the UN weapons inspectors in 1998. Our embassy was closed. We were caught definitely flat-footed in the immediate aftermath of the first Gulf War, knowing how far along the Iraqis were in their nuclear program. So my job was to try to find the scientists and figure out who they were, how far along were they, what were their projects, where were they getting the money, where were they getting the material. And so I tried to be a professional intelligence officer and suspend any sort of skepticism or anything. Just do the job, do the work.
But on the question of whether there was any link between Saddam Hussein's Iraq and 9/11, wasn't there the worm of doubt in your head there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there was a large disconnect. And it continued to grow. But just for me personally, I would say for my colleagues as well, at that time, we were so busy just trying to run operations. I'm trying to make sure that some guy over there has enough money. I'm trying to make sure we have a translator over there. There is just mountains of information coming in. And I'm not thinking about it in political terms, if you will. I am just trying to just do my job.
One more question on the political background before we get onto that whole yellow cake business, because that's the key. But in 2002, a friend of mine in Washington said, you've got to understand that this is like Tehran now. This city's like Tehran in the sense that there's a division in the political establishment between the mullahs, the true believers, and the pragmatists. Mm-hmm. And the true believers were Dick Cheney and others in the White House and the Department of Defense with Donald Rumsfeld. And the pragmatists are the State Department and the CIA. And there's a big divide, a fight for supremacy between those two warring sides. And the president, in the end, went with the true believers. Mm-hmm. Were you conscious of that division? Or have I even characterized it accurately?
I would say it was more, we didn't go to war, as we now well know, because of Iraq's nuclear capacities. We now know the president and his closest advisors understood that, knew that. There were other reasons for going to war, and I'll make it very brief, because I get asked this question a lot. I think the best way I can describe it is a cascade effect. It was the perfect storm. You have a president in power who's very unsure about his foreign policy credentials. We won't even go into the whole edible complex of what he thought Saddam Hussein tried to do to his father. Because he's quite unsure, he brings along Dick Cheney and really gives him a tremendous amount of influence. Dick Cheney now, his background is he was in the Nixon White House, and he saw what he perceived to be a deep erosion in presidential executive power. And he was bound and determined to make sure that came back. And The third factor, I would say, would be that neoconservatives were in positions of real influence throughout the government. And in fact, 1998, they had written a document called the Project for the New American Century, in which their manifesto calls for some sort of national disaster along the lines of Pearl Harbor, which they can use then to springboard off and use that to really expand American imperial power, if you will, throughout the world and redraw the map of the Middle East. And lo and behold, 9/11 comes along. So I wouldn't characterize as believers and non-believers.
Okay, that's a much better explanation of what was going on in 2002 than the one I just gave you. So, the yellow cake business. How did you come to be involved in this allegation that Saddam Hussein had bought or had tried to buy this nuclear material called yellow cake for the nuclear bomb program, from a country in West Africa, Niger?
Mm-hmm. I'll give you a brief refresher. In February 2002, I'm working at the CIA. I'm at CIA headquarters. I'm frantically trying to find intelligence. What the hell is going on in Iraq? I have someone come to me, someone who works for me, and she says, the office of the vice president just called me. Oh, really? Yes, and they want to know about this report, about this transfer of 500 tons of yellow cake uranium from Niger to Iraq. Huh. I mean, I was taken more with the notion that the office of the vice president had called this very, very low-level CIA staffer. I mean, there's ways you do that, and it's not that way. So we were discussing this, and someone comes by and hears this, and he says, well, why don't you ask Joe Wilson, my husband, why don't you ask him to go to Niger and check it out? And the reason he said that, he knew Joe had served in Niger. Joe had served on the NSC under Clinton for Africa. You know, he knew all the players. Let's just investigate this report that the president
So the idea to send
wants
Joe
to know.
came from?
Not from me. Let me make that absolutely clear, because I was accused of nepotism, because, you know, Niger is so lovely, and you want to spend your spouse. It's a dream posting. So we go and we tell my boss, and he says, well, Valerie, when you go home, just ask your husband to come in to headquarters in a few days. We'll get the right people around the table, and we'll figure out what we're going to do. So I did that. At that point, Joe had retired from the State Department. He was building his consulting business in Washington. But he came in, I wasn't at this meeting, and it was determined that he should go and check out this report because the office of the vice president had inquired. And it's in, our DNA. If someone that high asks you a question, the question is, well, how high do you jump? So Joe went to Niger, was not paid, comes back, gives his report, and they're dutifully writing everything down. And the report says, this is totally bogus. There's no way that this happened, and here's why. Okay, the report goes back into the system. It goes back to the office of the vice president. That's the last we think of it. Joe goes back to his consulting business.
Is it 2002?
2002. So just in the immediate months following 9/11. And I'm doing what I'm doing. So then fast forward to the following January 2003, and President Bush says in his State of the Union address, through British sources, we have recently learned that Saddam Hussein has sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. And I heard that, and I thought, Niger. But, guess what? Yellow cake is actually pretty common. Yellow cake, by the way, is a processed uranium ore that is used for part of the nuclear process. That's a whole bunch of yellow cake. And Joe heard it too, but again, we didn't know what the president was exactly referencing. And so as we moved toward war, we went to war in Iraq in March 2003, which is hard to believe, 15 years ago. We went to war, and as combat operations are winding down a few months later and the insurgency is gaining traction, there's more and more buzz about an unnamed ambassador and his trip to Niger that disproved this notion of yellow cake uranium. And so finally, Joe is told that if he wants to, he's talking to people discreetly, his former colleagues, people on the Hill, and he's told, listen, if you want to do anything about this, you're going to have to do it yourself because, that's not the party line. So in July of 2003, just 4 months after we had invaded Iraq, he wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times, What I Did Not Find in Africa. And in it, he went after the central rationale that the White House had given for our invasion of Iraq, which was an imminent nuclear threat. And that sort of started everything.
And then what happened in the White House, as far as you can tell?
And then what happened in the White House is the very next day after his op-ed piece came out, the White House comes out and, in a fashion, apologizes, if you will, and they say, well, that sentence in the President's State of the Union address did not rise. It wasn't very good. We're sorry. They didn't say that, but we're like, okay, we made a mistake. And Joe thought that was adequate. But a week later, after his op-ed appeared, there was a column in all the newspapers by conservative columnist Robert Novak, and he named me and said that I worked for the CIA and that I had been responsible for sending Joe to Niger, and implied that we were cooking something up together to embarrass the president and so forth. And that was
so by the time, before we get on to who gave Novak that information, before we get on to that, instantly your career is over in the CIA.
Yes.
That moment, how did it feel?
Like you're punched in the gut. There's no, I knew immediately what that meant. I was worried about my assets.
Just decode that. Worried about your assets. You don't mean your house and your car.
No.
You mean human assets.
Yeah. The people that I'd worked with.
Yeah, so it put them in danger.
Oh, jeopardy, absolutely. And even people that I did not have any sort of intelligence relationship with, even by virtue that they somehow were seen with me or photographed with me, that definitely put them in jeopardy as well.
Do you know if any of them suffered?
I don't know all the details. I don't.
No.
I know some, but not all.
You probably couldn't talk about it even if you did.
No.
Yeah.
And I worried about my children. My twins were 3 years old at the time, and I knew my career was over.
Who gave Novak that information?
Now, see, if there was someone else up here that, of a neoconservative bent, they would give a different answer. But I will give you the best answer I know, which is I'm not exactly sure. I know that there were quite a few. There were at least 6 sources in the White House that were floating this story and trying to make it about Joe Wilson and his CIA wife, Valerie, rather than why we went to war.
They threw you under the bus to protect the narrative that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the narrative that justified the invasion. That's what happened, isn't it?
Yeah, that's shorthand. Yeah. Yeah, it is, because they were at that particular. I would say that Joe's op-ed piece was hit so big, it was just that moment when the American public was kind of scratching collective head and going, "What? I thought you said this was about weapons of mass destruction," and the White House was getting very, very nervous. No weapons of mass destruction were being found. And Joe Wilson is this entirely establishment type kind of guy who's writing in the New York Times, hey, we were lied to. The intelligence was cherry picked. And it quickly became this crazy media maelstrom.
And I want to throw it open to the audience soon, but let's just finish this story because there were prosecutions. Scooter Libby got sentenced to 30 months in jail? But it was commuted by President
It was
Bush.
commuted, and then famously,
This year.
he was pardoned by Trump. Yes.
So, I want to talk to you about contemporary politics in Washington, but can you draw a line between what happened to you and the frankly unconstitutional and illegal way in which you were treated by people very, very close to President George W. Bush, and the kind of behaviour that is now so undermining or threatening to undermine the constitutional tradition of government in the United States under Donald Trump?
I think it's fair to say that over the last 2 decades, American politics have become ever more deeply divided, partisan. Our whole country now is deeply divided. We saw that. I would say the beginnings really were with the 92 election. Newt Gingrich came in as Speaker of the House, huge Republican wave, and he promptly told everyone in his Republican caucus, you are not going to have a drink with your Democratic colleagues. You know, it stops right here. And every year it got progressively worse. And then, of course, the mountains of money that have washed in, every year it has gotten worse. So what we saw in 2003 with what happened with me, and what we are seeing today in Trump's administration, it's a logical...
It's a pattern of unconstitutional or anti-constitutional behaviour.
Indeed.
Now, not having a drink with your Democratic opponent is kind of nasty and mean-spirited, but it's not actually illegal or unconstitutional. But we saw, with what happened to you, actually illegal and unconstitutional behaviour at the very pinnacle of American
treasonous,
policy.
one could say.
Treasonous. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you join the dots between what happened there and what is happening now?
Absolutely. So I'm as befuddled as anyone else watching what is happening with American politics. But I think what we're seeing in Trump is really a symptom. You know, I'd like to blame him for everything, but I can't. But because what we thought, actually, when we had 8 years of Obama, Americans are busily patting themselves on the back. We've elected a black president, and it's very progressive, and things are going to be better, and it's post-racial America, and all those great things. And in fact, the institutions, the very institutions in the United States that we rely upon for our civic life, were being deeply, deeply eroded. And it's like, you know, when you go out on the beach after a big storm, you're like, geez, I didn't know that cliff was so, that it crumbled so quickly. And I feel like that's where we are in American politics.
And how far it's come, just for one observation, I was having a conversation here with a bunch of friends earlier, and we were saying, isn't it amazing that people like us are sitting around a table at a progressive, book festival or a festival of ideas, praying that the CIA comes out of this in one piece, and because
they're not so bad.
The organization that started in my youth represented the projection of unaccountable American power around the world, now has become, on its own soil, the upholder of a constitutional tradition that we all cherish.
Yeah. The acts of this administration have been deeply antithetical to what we Americans value, and certainly in what we like to think of as public life.
Great. Let's have some questions from you. Yes, there's one there and one over here. Yeah.
Hi. So I was curious. Last year on Twitter, you got into some complications, and I used to manage Twitter for some of the Nobel laureates, and I was wondering. I feel like I have a love-hate relationship with Twitter, but I feel like your voice was really important at that time. Are you considering adding to that again?
No. So, yeah, that was a really horrific experience for me. I retweeted an article that I hadn't read all the way through. Allow me to be a warning to you. The only thing I saw, or that my eyes pulled out of this article, was at that time pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, which I am an adamant supporter. Well, it turns out the rest of the article was really filthy awful. And I was excommunicated. It was really, really a terrible experience. And so, I left. I mean, I made my sincere and deep apologies. I will never let this happen again.
It was a doozy, you said.
It was a doozy.
Yeah, don't really know what that means here.
No, I mean, it was terrible. Or with what the article said, that I didn't read it, right? You're moving really fast. Yeah. You're doing this on your phone as you're like getting in the car. I mean, stupid. In any case, as I have looked at Twitter since then, it sort of feels to me, I forget, it's like in the Harry Potter books, and they would get letters from home, and when you open it up, there's like screaming, ah! And that's what Twitter feels like. It is so ugly. And people have been really badly hurt. I don't feel that it serves any purpose anymore. Not for me. I mean,
but you took responsibility for that and fessed up straight away.
Within as soon as I could.
Let's get a question down here, and then there are two at the back there for this microphone when Valerie starts to answer.
Two-part related question. First of all, looking at all of the evidence in the public domain at the moment, what do you make of the allegation of Russian direct involvement in the election of President Trump? And relatedly, what do you make of President Trump's decision recently to remove the security clearance of former CIA Director John Brennan?
Great question. Thank you very much.
On the first part, I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that Russia definitely interfered with the 2006 election. There is no question. The question is how much, where, and how much does it go up to Putin? My sense is, Putin has a pretty weak hand, actually, but he's played it brilliantly. And they probably had no idea when it started back in 2014-15 how it was just really to sow chaos and doubt, and they've succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. I just happened, curiously enough, to be in Macedonia last month. And there's a tiny little village that I drove right by where there was a lot of Macedonian teenagers that were on Facebook and other social platforms in the run-up to the 2016 election. And they don't care who won. They don't care about Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. They were just trying to get clicks, right? And so they would post these outrageous stories, many of them in support of Trump and anti-Hillary. And every, selling advertising, and every click they got 2 more cents. And there's all these teenagers running around in this tiny Macedonian village, drinking, partying, driving fancy cars. And I thought, that's how democracy, we're gonna end with a whimper, right?
But can the integrity, sorry to interrupt you and hijack the question, can the integrity of the investigation into collusion from Russia be preserved, or will Donald Trump
That's a good question.
quash it?
I have utmost faith in Mueller. I think he is just such a Boy Scout, right? I mean, he's so careful. There are no leaks coming out. He has surrounded himself with the top people, but it's extremely political. So the question of where that goes, his report will land. And then whether impeachment is on the table is entirely a political question. Now, the second part was, Brennan.
Security clearance.
Right. I'm glad you asked that. Because I'm on various email lists of former colleagues and the intelligence community. So you see all this stuff flying by. And there's some of my former colleagues who I know and respect and think highly of. They hate Brennan so much. They see this, their question is sort of like, well, why should, no one should have a security clearance. He shouldn't just be automatically granted it. And they're running off in that direction. I think they risk becoming a tool of the Trump administration. I come down on the side that this is authoritarian behavior, trending behavior. I don't like Brennan. I don't like him at all. I got a whole bunch of reasons why I don't like him. It doesn't matter. What you are seeing in this is nothing short of McCarthy-era tactics.
Yeah, it's a lurch away from what America is famous for and valued for in the world, which is to say the constitutional exercise of power, towards the very thing in opposition to which the United States came into existence, which is to say the exercise of arbitrary power. Mm-hmm. And that's just one example, one small example
exactly.
of what has been happening.
Well,
over
we're
the
going to
last 2
see
years.
if more follow. Mm-hmm. I mean, at what point are the Republicans going to sit up and say enough? Don't forget that when Richard Nixon was in the depths of Watergate, it was Republican leaders who got up, got in their car, limos, whatever, went down from the Capitol to the White House and tapped him on the shoulder and said, Mr. President, it's time. It's time for you to go. And that's ultimately why he resigned. I do not see that happening in today's world.
Who's got somebody over here had their hand up? No. Okay, great. Well, there are two questions up there. Let's take them both at the same time.
Hello? Right. I was just going to ask with the whole thing about, as you said, about Iran and whatnot, and then Vietnam, and then Chile with Allende, where ITT put them out, and Ecuador, and then suddenly Noriega and Panama became the great unwanted. I was going to ask, now that China has gone into Africa now, and it's adopting the same disposable model as America's adopted in the last 30 years, how do you think the American, like CIA, is going to react to that?
Yeah,
and what are they doing to it?
The idea of 30 years ago that there's nothing left to spy on, that's gone away for sure.
Yeah.
There's a question, there's a gentleman halfway there with the microphone. Go ahead, yes, please.
What do you think of the notion that Donald Trump has actually been compromised by Russian security, and that's why he's behaving as he is?
Okay. We'll deal with the second one first, then we'll get on to China.
Okay, right. So it appears that there is compromising material, in my estimation. The Russians and almost everyone else is better in the world than the United States, than Americans. It's sort of long-range planning. Planting this early in the mid to late 80s, early 90s, Trump was down on his luck. He had no money. He was bankrupt. He was, borrowing here to pay there. And all of a sudden, he's flush sort of overnight. Where did he get that money? My betting is on dirty money. The Deutsche Bank, I'm very interested. What I love is, well, I don't love this, but it is fascinating from a political perspective. Like, you will hear of certain subpoenas and who Mueller has brought on as a specialist in money laundering and so forth. So I think that there is more there. But what is such a head scratcher to me is that there is a core base of American support for this president that it's sort of like, no matter what he does, we shall see. We shall see. And China. What was the question exactly? Like, are they as interested?
China going. The gentleman said China. We see now China going into Africa and elsewhere, and behaving really in the way that America behaved, or analogously, not in the same way, but analogously to the way America filled empty spaces in the world after 1945.
Yeah, and so I think the American century is over. I was in Tanzania a couple years ago, and I was all prepared for my African safari experience, and the Chinese construction firms were everywhere. Everywhere. I couldn't believe it. And it's clearly they are seeking domination. And
they're resource hungry, aren't they? That's what's driving it.
Oh, yeah. So, there'll be plenty of work for spies to do for the foreseeable future.
Yes, Samia.
Apart from all these boring stories in losing hope in politics, democracy, is there any kind of James Bond blonde girl stories, romantic dinners and erotic things that you would like to tell maybe later and make film script?
I'd love to tell you, but no, I loved my job. I was proud to serve my country. I loved what I did. Let me set one thing straight, though, that you don't sleep with people to extract intelligence. It's all very that gets very complicated very quickly, and there were times I would say when I was most concerned if I was meeting with terrorists, because that's something. But let me be clear, this whole job is not a lone wolf. This is not the Jason Bourne idea. You know, Hollywood's done a great job of portraying that. This is very much a team job. I might be the one meeting with the terrorist, but I have an analyst who has given me great questions. I have my surveillance team. I have, you know, there's a huge team, if you will, behind me. And it's a calculated risk, but the hope is you go in with knowing a little bit more than the person you're meeting with, right? So this Hollywood notion of running around with a gun, it's particularly for, I have to say, for other female operatives, we roll our eyes because if there's any chance to carry a gun, the guys want to do it. And it is so big surprise, right? But it's not, that's not how you collect intelligence. When a gun enters the conversation, everyone gets really quiet. So I'm sorry to disappoint you there.
We've all read John le Carre, and one of the things that he talks about is relations between the American intelligence community and the British intelligence community. Are we really friends? What do you lot think of our lot?
Well, without question, MI6 and Mossad, top intelligence agencies in the world. And I had plenty of good working relationships, but it's only, you know, on mutual targets, right? And otherwise, it's everything else is fair game. But if you're whether it's terrorism or nuclear stuff, if you're working together, and those, as we call them, liaison relationships with CIA's relationships with other intelligence services around the world, they're set up and established and nurtured for a couple reasons. One, for counterintelligence, make sure that you are not being penetrated. But secondly, so that you can work in tandem on these important targets. And
how badly damaged was the public's confidence in the intelligence communities by the disastrously inaccurate weapons of mass destruction assumptions that were made to justify the invasion of Iraq in 2003?
I'm not going to get myself in trouble talking about Tony Blair, you know. But I will say more. There was that, and it was, I would say, circular reporting. You know, they would plant a source on the front page of the New York Times. Next thing you know, there's Dick Cheney on a Sunday news show going, well, right here on the New York Times, it says right here that these aluminum tubes are used for centrifuges. So it's circular, and the Blair government totally went along with that. One thing that I think isn't brought out enough, I'd like to understand more, is both Blair and Bush were deep Christians, and they shared that religious conviction about what they were doing. That's not the whole thing, but it's a little piece of it.
That's not how they sold it to us, though, is it?
No, it's not how they sold it to us, but it maybe helps explain some of it. But more recently, I forget, there was a bombing here in the UK, and the Trump administration, I think Trump talked about how something was being, he's the one who leaked information or denigrated MI6 methods. When was that? Yeah, anyway, so they were furious, and as they should be. MI6 was absolutely furious that this sort of information had leaked
he was
to the
giving
public.
he was giving away information about the investigation before it became public.
Madness.
I'm being told by people at the top there to finish up now, but there is one more question, and because it's from William Dalrymple, I'm going to take it.
You mentioned Mossad, and you mentioned the Project for a New American Century.
Right.
As I understand it, the Project for New American Century was written by two neocons when they were working for the Likud party for the Israeli election under Netanyahu. How influential do you think the Likud party and Netanyahu have been in projecting Israeli policy into American foreign policy and making the two coalesce?
Yeah, tremendously. They are really treated as, Israel is treated, in my opinion, as a 51st state. Extraordinary influence. which has only grown under this administration. And I think it does the United States and it does Israel a deep disservice. We could have more to that conversation later.
And Valerie will be signing books through there and will be ready to carry on the conversation. Please come and buy a book. Get Valerie to sign it. This has been a tremendously engaging hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you.